Hello, everybody. Yes, I hope you're doing okay with all this weather. So we've got another day where it's, I think the university's closed till Sunday. I'm not even sure about next week when you look at the weather forecast. So we just got to muddle through. I thought I would put a nice tropical beach behind me. In fact, I was in Kenya for sort of over the break. I wasn't actually by the beach, but it had that nice tropical sort of weather. So I'm feeling a bit, we're not really enjoying this. Remember, I told you I had to go out on Tuesday to get some shopping. It actually took us about half an hour to actually get out of our door because there was so much ice that we had to sort of, to just start pouring some water onto that. And then we had to go and open the gate, which took another, ridiculous amount of time. And it's pretty hairy out there. So hopefully you're staying safe and things are okay wherever you are. Okay, so let's carry on with the second part of our lectures on comparative advantage. And remember, on Tuesday we went up to the point where we sort of basically defined comparative as opposed to absolute advantage. Comparative advantage, someone has comparative advantage, or a nation has comparative advantage when they can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than their competitor. And from now, we're going to take a step back and try and look at this from a slightly different angle, and then we'll bring it back to the whole idea of comparative advantage. Okay, and we're going to do this through looking at another model. We've sort of looked at the sort of cost benefit analysis. We've looked a little bit about sort of comparative advantage, but we haven't really modeled it. So we're going to model it now through looking at something called the production possibilities frontier. And this is just a very simple way of modeling a economic situation such that we can gain insight into it. So imagine looking at this model. This, on the vertical axis, there's the amount of coffee beans in pounds a day that someone can produce. Maybe it's just one person, and a number of nuts in pounds per day that someone can produce. And if you look, this is the same person. So if they concentrated purely on coffee, they would produce 24 pounds. If they concentrated purely on nuts, they would produce 12 pounds. And that's about that. A is the 24 pounds purely coffee. 12 is the 12 pounds of nuts, purely nuts. B is a sort of mixture, and C is a mixture. And so by doing this, we can model all the different potential production possibilities there are for this particular person that has skills in making coffee beans or doing nuts, And so if we look at it, we've got certain things going on. If you look at the sort of this one where it says unattainable combination, that's like pie in the sky. You couldn't get that. Only we'll see later on how we can get to that position. An attainable point will be inside the production possibilities frontier. This inefficient combination is, maybe this person is producing 8 pounds of coffee and 4 pounds of nuts, but they're not using all their time. It's an inefficient point. An efficient point is going to be something along the production possibilities frontier, A, B, C, or D. And the scarcity principle is that if you're on the production possibilities frontier, the only way you can get more of one good is by giving up some of the other. So if you're at point B and you think, I really need some more coffee, yeah, you can do that, but only if you're giving up some nuts. And this is a very, very important principle, the scarcity principle. Ultimately, if you're the mayor of Memphis and say, yeah, we're going to spend more money on police, and then we're going to spend more money on trying to get the education, and we're going to spend more money on health. you have to say, well, sorry, where's that money going to come from? Unless there's some, level of corruption and some money's disappearing in a negative way. If we assume all the money is being spent rightly, the only way you can spend more on one thing is by taking it out of another. That's the scarcity principle, and the production possibilities frontier shows this well. So this is Krisha's production possibilities frontier. We've seen it already. They can work 6 hours a day, and ultimately those 6 hours can be allotted to coffee beans, or allotted to nuts, or a mixture of the two. So 1 hour of labour could produce 4 pounds of coffee beans or 2 pounds of nuts. And the graph shows options. Obviously, there's a negative slope. As we'll see, there's a reason for that negative slope, because it means to gain something you have to give up something else, and that's a production possibilities frontier. And so if we think about it, that if for example, Krisha wants 4 pounds of nuts, she's got to give up 8 pounds of coffee beans. And so the marginal benefit is 4 pounds of nuts. The marginal cost is 8 pounds of coffee beans. Or we can think the opportunity cost of 1 pound of nuts is 2 pounds of coffee beans. We can use different models to sort of get to that same truth. That basically, if she wants more nuts, she's got to give up coffee beans. And then, if think about it the other way round, if she wants 16 pounds of coffee beans, she's got to give up 8 pounds of nuts. And what do you think the opportunity cost of a pound of coffee beans is? Just think about it. Maybe pause the video. It's half a pound of nuts, So it's often the inverse when it's two things, because it's 1 pound of nuts, the opportunity cost is 2 pounds of coffee beans. The inverse is that 1 pound of coffee beans, you're going to have to give up half a pound of nuts. Hopefully you've got this, and it sounds maybe a bit deceptively simple, but we'll see from this we can build up many, many things. So, forgotten about Krisha. There's another player in this whole equation, and that's Tom. He can work 6 hours a day, and the slope of the production possibilities curve is driven by the productivity of the person. In this case, not so good with coffee, but a lot better with nuts. So 1 hour of labour is 4 pounds of nuts or 2 pounds of coffee. Remember, Krisha was the other way around. 4 pounds of coffee and 2 pounds of nuts. And so, in a way, all of these figures for Tom is the inverse of the figures for Krisha. The marginal cost of 8 pounds of nuts is minus 4 pounds of coffee. So, what's the opportunity cost? Maybe pause the video, think about it. Okay, so that's the opportunity cost of 1 pound of coffee beans is 2 pounds of nuts, and the opportunity cost of 1 pound of nuts is half a pound of coffee beans. So if the question asked you, what's the opportunity cost of 1 pound of nuts? The answer is half a pound of coffee beans. And then for 1 pound of coffee beans, it's 2 pounds of nuts. Notice it's the inverse of the situation with Krisha. Now, that doesn't have to be the case all the time. It could not be exactly symmetrical. It's just the way they've set this up. As you'll see, it makes it makes it look interesting. So, if we bring both their production possibilities curves together, it will look something like this. That Krisha obviously clearly has a comparative advantage when it comes to coffee, and Tom clearly has a comparative advantage when it comes to nuts. So it's steeper. Krisha's is steeper, better for coffee. Tom's curve is flatter, better for nuts. And comparative advantage is a comparison. To get £1 of coffee beans, Krisha gives up half a pound of nuts. So she's got a lower opportunity cost, but Tom has to give up £2 of nuts. So Krisha's got the lower opportunity cost when it comes to producing coffee beans. And you can very much see it from this graph, and the other way around. Clearly Tom has a lower opportunity cost when it comes to producing nuts because he's only giving up half a pound of coffee. So if they both said, well, we're going to live in our own little world, I'll create my nuts over here and my coffee over there, and you'll create your nuts and coffee in a different place. They would be stuck along their red or blue lines. But look what happens when they agree to specialize and trade. If you just produce what you consume, you're going to be stuck along your production possibilities frontier. But with trade, each person's consumption can be greater than production. Basically you produce according to where you have your comparative advantage and trade to get where you want. So it goes from this situation, and remember, let's say like 12-12, which would be sort of, if you took a line from the 12 coffee beans to, and then go down to 12 nuts, that would be an unattainable point for either Tom or Krisha. But because really with no trade, each is going to be able to have about £8 of coffee beans and £8 of nuts, and the total output is going to be about £32. Now, but if the specialization, will give each person £12 of each goods. So if you think about it, because each is having, Krisha and Tom in the first case is £8 of coffee and £8 of nuts. So altogether that's going to be 32. But if they specialize and trade, notice each is going to be able to have 12 of each. So 12 for Tom of coffee, 12 for Tom of nuts, 12 for Krisha of coffee, 12 for Krisha of nuts. Altogether 48 total pounds, and bang, you're outside the production possibilities frontier. And so specialization and trade, now we're talking about two individuals here, but it basically allows people to consume beyond their production possibilities frontier, and that's the power of trade. That's the wonderful thing about trade. Okay. And so benefits increase when differences in opportunity costs increase. Let's imagine it's even more. Imagine that Tom can create £30 of nuts and just £6 of coffee, and Krisha could create £30 of coffee and £6 of nuts. Then that means, that Krisha's opportunity cost of £1 of nuts increases to £5 of coffee beans, and then Tom's opportunity cost of £1 of coffee beans increases to £5 of nuts. And so no trade would mean that they're in this position where they've got basically £5 of nuts and £5 of coffee beans each. But with trade, it's going to be £10 of nuts and £10 of coffee beans each, isn't it? Because each is going to be able to sort of have 30. Produce 30 of their particular good. Okay, and so no, actually, if you look at that, I think the slide has got that wrong. It would actually be 15, because it'd be 60 altogether. You know what I mean? With trade, it'll actually be much more than that. They've actually got this a little bit wrong. With trade, actually, I should sort of change that. Because if you think about it, it should be 15, because it's going to be 4 times, 60 divided by 4 is going to be 15. Okay, so let's move this from a world of Krisha and Tom to a world of an economy. An economy that can maybe produce, thousands, coffee beans, maybe 100,000 pounds of coffee a day, or thousands pounds of coffee a day, so 100,000 pounds of coffee, which will be 100 tons of coffee, or 80,000, so 80 tons of nuts. And again, you've got the different points along the production possibilities frontier. And so, ultimately there's going to be lots and lots of different people involved in these trades. This is the economy of an entire country, Now, what you notice, and something you may notice about this that's different from the other production possibilities frontier we've seen. Maybe pause the video. What's the difference? Yes, it's curved. Now, why is it curved? The reason it's curved is that, let's imagine if everyone in the economy was told to make coffee, there was a problem, because obviously some of those people will not be so skilled at making coffee than they're skilled in making nuts. If everyone is, having to do coffee, but there's loads of skilled nut makers, that means they're not going to be so good. So basically, if you try to really shoehorn the economy so everyone's producing coffee, that's not going to be so good, because some of the resources for making nuts are better for making nuts. So, in the two extremes, the curve shows that you actually produce more when you're in the middle. So that the people that are good at making nuts can make nuts, the people that are good at making coffee can make coffee. So it's better to be in the middle in this case. That's why it's curved. And basically, as you move along, let's say, for example, you're at D and you think, I just really want more nuts. It's actually going to have a higher opportunity cost to move to E, because you're going to be forcing people that are brilliant coffee makers to suddenly switch to nuts. And so the opportunity cost is going to be rising as you move along that line. So you could produce 100,000 things of coffee a day. And at this point, when you're really up at that point, if you look at moving from B to A, B is 95,000 pounds of coffee, and you want to move to A, which is 100,000 pounds of coffee, you've got to give up 20,000 pounds of nuts. Because all those people that are really good at making nuts and can make them really easily are suddenly going to have to move to coffee, which they're not so good at, but if you want to then, say go down from 95 to 90, the opportunity cost is slightly less. You're only giving up 10,000 pounds of nuts. And think about it from C to D. C to D, you're gaining 70,000. You're losing 70,000 pounds of coffee, 90 to 20, but you're actually the opportunity cost is 47,000 pounds of nuts. And so the opportunity cost is changing along that line. You can just play with it and look at it yourself and you'll see that. And so ultimately, that's the principle of increasing opportunity cost. So you would start, if you wanted to make coffee, first you'd get all the really brilliant coffee makers, all the brilliant fields that are good at making coffee. There's a low opportunity cost in using those. It's easy to make that beginning amount of coffee. But then as you try and say, I'm going to have more and more coffee, more and more coffee, more and more coffee, you're going to have to, there's going to be higher opportunity costs. It's a bit like that with oil. Oil, maybe in parts of Texas, very, very easy to reach. Parts of Oklahoma, very, very easy to reach. Part of the Gulf Coast, very, very easy to reach. But other parts of oil in the US are more difficult. You've got to do fracking, you've got to break up the whole Earth's tectonic plates, and so there's a higher opportunity cost, and that's a general principle. If you want more of a good in an economy, you're going to have to, there's going to be a higher cost, a higher opportunity cost. And so there's going to be decreasing productivity as you have to pay more to get that particular more of that particular good. And so this is all about a dynamic moving economy, and the production possibilities curve represents current choices, but they change over time. You invest in capital, you invest in machinery, you invest in technology. Population grows, there's more workers. There's improvements in technology, more specialization, startup and switching costs, increase in knowledge. And so the production possibilities frontier moves. That's the whole principle of it. There's all sorts of things that can sort of move it along. Maybe there's a technical improvement in everything. So suddenly there's just better machines for everything. There's coffee, beans, and nuts. The entire production possibilities frontier moves on. But then sometimes when it comes, it's just with coffee beans. There's been a technical improvement. So this is how you would model it on our little model that we've created. Now, let's sort of move this now from the realm of one country to more countries, because as countries start to specialize, in what they have comparative advantage in, then you're going to have, as we showed with Tom and Krisha, you're going to have a new production possibilities frontier. You're going to be able to push beyond the production possibilities frontier. So, ultimately, why would people not specialize? Why would they resist it? Often when there's a low population density, it's quite hard to get the sort of efficiencies that make for comparative advantage. It's easier when markets are connected. There's transportation for goods. I studied a country called Chad in Africa, and that had a lot of oil, but it was right in the centre of the African continent. So they had to build this enormous pipeline to the Gulf of Guinea to be able to ship that oil. And sometimes countries don't particularly have a good legal framework that supports business, and that whole sort of system. But at the same time, there can be too much specialisation. Imagine this. If you've got a hairstylist that only cuts blonde hair, or 7 cafes, each open on a different day in the week. An expert in tropical diseases opens a practice in a town of 500 people in Wisconsin. It would be ridiculous. You can have all that, and there's reasons for resisting specialisation. And also, we know that that when it comes to international trade, because now the US specializes in services, finance, tech, very, very high-end manufacturing, that's meant lots of people have lost their jobs in maybe low-end manufacturing. And the question is, was that a good thing? Because when we talk about comparative advantage, this makes sense when it's on an international level, because the gains from the trade between Tom and Krisha and the gains in trade that we saw on Tuesday really are best suited when these are across nations. China does what they're good at. India does what they're good at. England does what, Britain does what they're good at. America does what they're good at, and then everyone has more. That's the whole idea. They're very, very large gains from trading with different and distant countries, but it can be controversial because trade benefits everyone. Like in Walmart, there's all these incredible cheap goods because of the gains from trade and comparative advantage. It's much better to let someone in Bangladesh or in China just make the clothes or the electronics, and we can get them much, much cheaper. It's wonderful. But, it's great having all these cheap goods in the shops, but if you've lost your job because your factory moved to China, that's a problem. And so trade can be controversial. People lose their jobs. Some industries suffer. And you have this phenomena of outsourcing, custom call centers, medical tourism, technical writing, medical transcription. That's been wonderful for people in the Philippines. Well, it has been wonderful for maybe a generation for the people in the Philippines or India who run a lot of these call centers and stuff like that. But now, because AI is completely taking them over, they're some of the real front lines of people losing their jobs through AI is actually happening in the developing world, like India and Philippines. And so, these are very, very controversial areas. But when you hear economists say, trade is good, trade is good, trade is good, it's true because trade will make things cheaper if everyone concentrates on their comparative advantage. But there are sort of weaknesses. Do you trust the quality of certain things? I think now with Chinese goods, we trust the quality. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, we didn't. When it comes to very complex communication, sometimes I get very frustrating talking to someone, from a call center on the other side of the world. Sometimes I don't really understand what you're saying. But ultimately, this whole world of trade and comparative advantage means that people have to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Okay, so just to go over everything, obviously you've got probably lots of questions about this. Try and sort of reach out to office hours or something if you're confused. But remember, the production possibilities frontier on an individual level leads to comparative advantage, leads to specialization and gains from trade. We can think of it on an individual level or on a country level or an economy level. And you realize that comparative advantage leads to increasing opportunity cost. By completely specializing in one area, the opportunity cost will be rising, and that will. But also at the same time, the production possibilities frontier can change as things become more efficient. Remember, specialization and gains from trade is great in theory, but the reality of a lot of the outsourcing that's happened to American jobs because of this system of global comparative advantage has led to outsourcing, which has been very controversial. Okay, so that's it. I know this is a bit difficult this week. We really hope we're going to be back in person next Tuesday. But for the moment, let's leave it there. But if you've got any questions, just give me a call and we will speak.